Welcome back. This is the first video for Chapter 2 in Introduction to Programming and Problem Solving Using Processing. And in this video we're going to go ahead and start learning about the fundamentals that we need to actually write programs. So we're going to move on from learning about just computers and then transition into actually writing programs to make the computers do what we want to do. Here's our outline. In this video we're going to go ahead and talk about variables and the types that those variables can have, because those are very important subjects, and it makes sense to start with variables because that's what all programs deal with. In the next video then we'll talk about expressions and arithmetic, and in particular we'll focus on mathematical expressions. Following that we'll have one more on expressions and arithmetic that'll focus on Boolean expressions, things which can be true or false, and relational expressions, where we learn how to compare things. After that we'll do a programming example, a temperature conversion program where we convert degrees Fahrenheit to degrees Celsius or vice versa. And then we'll kind of throw that example away because it's not exactly exciting. So we'll learn about graphics, how to do graphics in processing, and then finally our last video in this Chapter 2 series will be our second example for the chapter, where we create a test pattern using our graphical abilities in processing. So let's get started. Start talking about variables. So in our programs, a variable is just a name for a spot in memory, a chunk of data, and that again is called a variable. And so in some sense all of our programs can be seen as instructions that tell us how we're going to manipulate those variables, how we're going to transform the data, whether it be a simple example like our Fahrenheit to Celsius conversion program, or a more complicated example like whatever it is you're playing on Xbox these days. It's the instructions that are changing the data that are important, obviously, as well as the data itself, but the program is what manipulates the data. So a good place to start is to learn about programming, learning about variables rather, when we're going to study programming. So that's where we're going to begin. Now before we start though, it's important to realize that we have a different notion of a variable than from mathematics. So in mathematics, a variable is a symbol that's used to represent a value from a set. For example, in algebra it's common to use letters to represent values from the set of real numbers. And this example here illustrates that. This is the formula to compute the volume of a sphere. Obviously you knew that. But in this case we have two variables and a constant. Pi is constant, but r, the radius of the sphere, and v, the volume of the sphere, are variables. And both v and r stand in for positive real numbers. And they just tell the relationship between v and r, related according to this formula. Okay? So r really could be any old number from the positive real numbers, and v would be the resulting volume based on this relationship. Alright? So, programming variables are not like that at all. They're different. A variable, again, is a name given to a certain portion of memory, not a representative of a whole set of values. So it's, if you think of a box in memory, it's going to hold something. The variable is the name for the box. And that variable, being a box, can only hold one thing at a time. So it's perfectly sized to hold one value and one value only. It doesn't stand in for a whole range of values. Also, it's important to notice that in processing, every variable has a type that tells us the type of thing, the kind of thing that's in the box, whether it be an integer, a floating point number, a color, all kinds of different things. Alright, so let's take a look at an example to sort of clarify this. Here's an integer variable in processing. In this line, we're going to read it from left to right. This would appear in the text of a program. Remember, a program is just a text file that we type in. So int is a keyword in the processing language. That means I'm creating an integer variable. X happens to be the name of that variable that I just created, and the equals 19 part says that I'm going to put a value into that box. Okay? So I'm putting the 19 into the box labeled X. So let's look at that graphically. Somewhere out in memory, when I declare an integer variable, processing creates a box that's just large enough to hold one integer. Okay, and in processing, that's 32 bits. And it uses a scheme that's something like the binary encoding that we talked about in Chapter 1. Not exactly, but you get the idea. Okay, so this is just big enough to hold one integer value. Now, every piece of memory has an address, and this is no exception. So there's 4 bytes here, 32 bits. The first byte, let's say, has this address, and this is a hexadecimal number. Okay? But since we gave the variable a name, it also has a name associated with it, and that's how we're going to refer to that box. Rather than having to know its address, we know the variable name, and that's a lot easier for us to understand. And finally, the value. 19, and in this case it's written in decimal rather than in hex or binary, is the value that's stored in that box. Okay? So this is the picture that you want to have when you talk about a variable in processing. It's just a chunk of memory given a certain name and a certain value. That box can only hold one thing at a time. Okay? That's what a variable is in a programming language. Now, we have to get more specific about our data types. There's 2 broad categories of variables in processing, what are called primitives and what are called references. Okay? Primitive variables are things that hold their addresses directly. We'll talk about references in a little while. And there are 6 different kinds of primitive variables in processing based on what goes in the box. There's Boolean, byte, char, color, float, and int. Okay, that's it. Those are the 6 different types of variables that you can have in processing that are primitives. Now let's take a look at those 6 types, talk a little bit about the size and number of bits that's used for each box that these variables are created or are stored in, and then the range of values that the variables of that type can take on. All right. Unfortunately, since this is alphabetical, we're going to start with Boolean, which is a little squirrely, because we don't know necessarily how many bits are used on your computer to store a Boolean variable. That has to do with the fact that the Java specification, and processing is built on top of Java, doesn't restrict how many bits you need for a Boolean, and so you can't really say for sure. It might be different from machine to machine. But in any case, the range for Boolean is only 2 values, true or false. Okay, so everything that's a Boolean variable has either true or false in it, only 2 options. Byte is a little bit more straightforward. There's 8 bits, and it contains a signed 8-bit integer. And so our range is from a -128 to 127. So every byte variable is a box that has 8 bits, is 8 bits long, and contains one of these values. Okay? Char, which is short for character, 16 bits long, and those are Unicode characters. So if you imagine anything that you could type on a keyboard, that's one of the Unicode characters, and that would fit in a char variable. And in fact, anything that anybody could type on a keyboard all over the world, whether it be Chinese, Arabic, Russian, whatever, it's in the Unicode character set and would be placed in a char variable. So a single typable character is what that is. Color is a little bit unique. Most other programming languages don't have a primitive variable for colors, but processing does. 32 bits that represents colors in a red, green, blue, alpha color scheme, or one of the other color schemes that processing has. But we'll talk about that a little bit more when we introduce graphics. Okay, floating point, or a float, 32 bits long, and the range is roughly -2 to the 127th to 2 to the 127th. So a huge range of values. That's a mind-bogglingly large number. Okay, but floats are inexact, so they don't store all the precision, and these are used for things that have decimal points, like pi, for instance, 3.14 would be a float value. If you don't need decimal points, then you want to use an int, which is also 32 bits long, and its range is roughly plus or minus 2 billion. Okay? So there are our 6 primitive variable types or data types and their ranges, which leaves us with one more data type to discuss, and that is the reference type. Okay? A reference type is a variable that holds the address of something else in memory. Okay? And that's going to let us to refer to what are called objects. We'll talk about that in Chapter 3. Okay? So a reference variable indirectly refers to something in memory via this address, and once again, it's used to refer to objects, which we'll talk about in Chapter 3. So let's look at a picture again. Here's a reference variable in processing. Well, not yet, actually. This is a primitive character variable named C. It's got a value of Z. Okay? This is that conceptual diagram that we talked about, the idea that you want to have a box in memory, 16 bits long. It's got the name of C, has an address, but I really don't care what that is, and it's got the value Z placed in it. What if I want something more complicated, though? Like I want a string of characters, some text, like hi mom. Okay? Well, first of all, this is the data type, string, but it's got a capital S as opposed to a lowercase s. That means that this is an object of type string rather than a primitive. And you don't have any idea maybe what an object is yet, but that's okay. Hold that thought until Chapter 3, and we'll talk more about objects. But in any case, its variable name is hi, and its data is this series of characters, hi mom. Okay? Notice that we've got 2 quotes around the string, single quotes around a character. That's another important differentiation. If I want to have a literal value, that's a character, single quotes, literal string, double quotes. But what I don't have down here in my picture, or over here, is the name hi. That's because the variable hi doesn't contain this data. Instead, hi is a different variable, different address, different section of memory. It's 32 bits long, and what it's going to contain is this address. That is the address where the string is stored in memory. All right? So that's why we have an indirection going on, because we use this variable hi to get to the string hi mom, but we have to actually go to the variable, read the address, and go to that spot in memory. Now the computer takes care of all that for you, but it is important to understand that that's how that works. That'll become a lot more important when we start talking about objects in the next chapter, and also when we start talking about how to compare objects. This picture, this differentiation, is really, really important. Okay, that's the end of this introduction about variables and data types. In the next section, we're going to cover expressions, and in particular, talk about mathematical expressions. So, see you then.